spent over 40 years studying Korea. And so I'm sitting there saying, what do I choose to talk about? What do I ignore? What do I include? How do I reduce all of this into 35 or 40 minutes? And so I agonized quite a bit. Yeah, it's not at all uncommon to hear people in Korea talk about 5,000 years of history, 5,000년의 역사, or 반만년의 역사, the history of a half a millennium. Not a millennium, what is it, half of 10,000 years? I'm sorry, nobody has 5,000 years of history, not the Egyptians, not the Chinese, nobody. And we historians look at Korea. We say, well, Korea starts appearing in Chinese texts sometime around 500 or 600 before current era. So we could call that sort of proto-history. We really don't see Korea as being fully historical until around the 1st century before current era, maybe, or the 1st century of the Common Era. So where does this come from? Why do people say 5,000 years of history? Well, there are a couple things. One is this. This is Tangun Harawaji, the mythological founder of the first Korean state. And the myth tells us that his father came down from heaven and married a bear woman and had a child who's known to us as Tangun, and Tangun established the first state in Korea, Tangun Chosun, or Old Chosun. This happened 2,333 before the Common Era. But myths are myths, right? But where does this come from? I think this comes from certain assumptions about the Neolithic peoples who lived in Korea 3,000 years ago. Scholars believe that they can trace cultural continuity from Neolithic times down to today. And scholars also assume that those Neolithic peoples who lived in Korea 5,000 years ago are the direct ancestors of today's Korean people. So I guess that's where they come off with 5,000 years of history. I might accept 5,000 years of cultural continuity, but as an historian, I have trouble with 5,000 years of history. A third myth that I'd like to talk about is the idea of that Korean history is a story of incessant invasions by foreigners. It's a history of suffering inflicted by outsiders. The Korean term for this is sunan의 역사. And basically they say Korean history is a long, sad story of constant invasions by foreigners, by outsiders. To be sure, the last 150 years of Korean history have seen a lot of misery inflicted by outsiders. Imperial competition over Korea in the late 19th century, colonization by Japan, division of the country by the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945, Korean War that broke out in 1950, ended up with US and Chinese forces wreaking havoc on much of the peninsula. So the past 150 years, I'd say yes. You can characterize Korean history like that. If you go back to earlier Korean history, it becomes much more problematic. Here we have some 20th century, 21st century depictions of foreigners invading Korea. The one on your left, I think, is a painting valorizing Korean peasants resisting the Mongol invaders in the 13th century. And the one on your right is a modern reenactment of Japanese invaders of the late 19th century slaughtering poor innocent Koreans. We get a lot of that. But the real truth is that Korean history is also characterized by very long periods without any invasions from outside. You can go from the second half of the 7th century to the end of the 10th century, a period of a little over 3 centuries, no outside invasions. You can go from the early 11th century through the mid 13th century. You've got over 200 years without invasions. You go to the 15th and 16th centuries, no invasions. And you go the second half of the 17th century through the mid 19th century, no invasions. 200 and 300 year periods when Korea was not invaded from the outside. I would say that's a rather exceptional case in human history. Maybe Japan, surrounded, protected by its waters, but certainly not China, and certainly not countries like Poland, for heaven's sakes, which is here one day, there the next day, and gone the next, thanks to its Russian and German neighbors. Rather, I would say that it was during these long periods of peace that Koreans really began to develop a sophisticated variant of East Asian civilization in the peninsula. So I'm going to switch over to my main themes now. And the first thing I want